Age of Wonders 4's unit enchantments are very good. In this video, I'll be evaluating their power level, their opportunity cost, when do you get them, how much do they cost to unlock and run, their synergies, particularly within class, and any unique effects that they might provide. If you like this kind of content, please do consider subscribing. I'm such a nerd, I even made the tier list for this video. Let's crack in. We're going to start with the Age of Wonders 4 database and then move through into the actual game to take a look at most of the enchantments, but there are a couple that aren't aligned to the traditional affinity trees. For starters, there are two general research tomes. You will have seen these, anyone can get them right from the start of the game, and they're to do with scouting. The first one is Enchanted Crow Companion. It gives our scouts +2 vision range on the world map, and again, only impacts our scouts. And then the second one, because I'm going to rank them the same ranking, is Wayfinder Enchantment. This one gives our scouts extra movement, but not extra vision. So you can see the way that these two play out. One gives our scouts a bit of extra vision, so we can see more as we move, and the other one lets us move faster, so we can see more. In many ways, they do the same thing, although of course, there are different use cases for moving quickly, maybe quickly running to grab something on the map, as opposed to vision, which might be more useful for keeping an eye out for enemy armies than movement. But either way, they effectively do the same thing. They give you an early research option before you've researched anything else, though you will quickly move into other ones, and they just target your scout units, which you may have, let's say, 2 of. These are decent abilities that give you more vision range or more movement on your scouts than the enemy. However, the usefulness of the scout does fall away once you've discovered those few city-states around you or found the enemy. Particularly, of course, as you move through to the later game, you won't find much usefulness out of these enchantments. I rank both of these at a C tier. Don't get me wrong, I think that they provide good value in doing what they do, in boosting scouts. And perhaps in a more shadowy build, you might want to place them at B or even an A. But generally speaking, I don't think they provide enough value, especially over the long run, to really justify picking these up, keeping the upkeep. As you move through the later game, you might not want to have many scouts, if any. And I think that the overall impact that they provide is going to be a lot less, probably, than the first thing that you're researching inside of your tome, giving you a very small window of opportunity to make value out of these ones. For me, they're a high C tier, falling just below average. There are also 6 cultural enchantments. They're all tier 3 enchantments. They cost roughly the same amount as one another, and they all do the same thing. What they do is they give non-cultured units the benefit that your cultured units would have. So inside of Brand of Wrath, it grants our non-dark units, and this is of course a dark culture enchantment, Cull the Weak, which increases damage dealt to enemies with negative status effects, and it affects all of the types of units that we'd want it to. The same is true for all of these enchantments. They all generally do the same thing. Provide the cultural benefit to units not of your cultural type. Because they're all the same, I'm going to rank them all the same. They effectively do the same thing, just across different cultures, right? And I think what they do is very powerful and very unique. And of course, it unlocks a huge amount of synergy. It ticks a lot of boxes for me in my evaluation criteria. Unlocked as a tier 3 spell, you'll generally get it early enough to make use of it, particularly as you may be unlikely to have other kinds of cultures or races inside of your empire until you start to move through to that kind of early mid-game. I think that this effect is incredibly strong, providing benefits that you will be giving to your culture, to all of your units. It's an incredibly unique ability in that this is really the only way you can do this. For me, the cultural ones are S tier inside of this tier list because they provide so much value and so much internal synergy to your empire, I don't think it can be ignored. Time to look at order. Inside of the Tome of Zeal, tier 1, we have the Legion of Zeal. This one is a skill level 2 unit enchantment, and it provides Zeal, which makes base damage deal extra spirit damage. In this case, it deals an extra 2 spirit damage, and the damage is doubled against units who are condemned. Of course, an internal synergy that we'll return to a little later. It affects all types of units, providing them with this Zeal benefit, universally applied and very early to unlock. I think that Legion of Zeal's obvious internal synergies, cheap unlock, early unlock, and universally applied benefit make it an S tier unit enchantment. It's very cheap to pick up and very synergetic within the class. Of course, we'll be dealing with spirit damage a lot, as well as potential for condemnation synergies. It's an S tier pickup for me. Next up, we have Staves of Mending, again within tier 1 of the Order affinity, in this case Tome of Faith. This one grants us 10% less upkeep by granting our enchanted units Faithful. It also provides Mending Touch, which gives the ability to use this healing ability, cooldown of 2 turns, heals the target for 15 temporary hit points. It's important to note that in this case, it only applies to our support units, so this is an enchantment strictly for the support class, and I think it's a pretty good one at what it does. We're likely to have quite high upkeep. Reducing that is great, although in this case, it is just 10% on our support units. So important to note, it's not very wide-reaching. The Mending Touch ability, however, is great. Can't be used when an enemy's within zone of control, so you will need to keep in the backline where you should be. But having a heal ability early on at tier 1, once you've got your support units, is nice to pick up. I give the Staves of Mending a B tier. It's a pretty strong B tier, but because it just impacts the support units, it's not as wide-reaching as many of the other enchantments. What it does do is nice with the 10% saving, but again, it's not all that impactful. I think this is a great enchantment for the support units, but not as wide-reaching or impactful as many others on this list. For me, it's a B tier. Inside the Tome of Inquisition, we have Inquisitor's Zeal. Here we have, of course, some more Zeal synergy coming through. Inside of a tier 2 tome, it's a skill level 4 spell. This one grants Zeal again. Base attacks deal +2, with, of course, that bonus against condemned units. And this time, we also receive +10% accuracy on physical ranged attacks. So a specific buff to physical range, 10% accuracy, and this is, of course, applied to our skirmishers and our ranged units. So a couple of classes, but ultimately, it's just physical ranged attacks that benefit with the +10% accuracy and damage, and we'll be dealing Zeal damage as well. So again, a slightly specialized one, pretty decent at what it delivers. It's unfortunate that there aren't those wonderful Materium archers hidden inside of Order. Of course, if you're reaching across trees to grab the synergy, this is a fantastic pickup for those ranged units with the extra accuracy on physical attacks. Plus, we also receive more Zeal, combining with our condemnation and our internal synergies. However, again, this is quite a specialized one, just looking at physical ranged attack and only providing +10% to our accuracy. So no extra damage beyond the Zeal. For me, this is a close call, and it always has been a close call between the A and the B tiers. I'm going to place it at a high B tier. This one, though, very on the fence about this. Very on the fence. If I let myself lean into Materium and grab some great archers, it's certainly an A tier. But I think more universally applied, a B tier ranking is fair. Inside of Tome of the Beacon, we have Mighty Meek. Mighty Meek provides Faithful. Again, that's that -10% to unit upkeep, and it provides +1 spirit damage on attacks for each unit tier of the target. So if the target unit is a tier 4 unit, then you'll receive +4 spirit damage. And nice to have an effect that scales up a little bit with enemy strength, although it probably doesn't scale enough, of course, to account for the scaling strength of the enemy. And in this case, it affects all tier 1 units. Obviously, this one is kind of leaning more towards a chaotic build, a nature build, something with a lot of tokens, and we can pull that off a little bit inside of Order, but there are better synergies outside of it. Faithful is great. All of our tier 1 units also receive a little bit of extra spirit damage, making them more competitive with stronger units. Mighty Meek for me is a C tier pick. There are some synergies a little bit with later things that we'll see inside of Supreme Magic, where we can have these kind of explosive units, cheap token units. But the rest of the synergies just aren't really here within class. Yes, there are some elsewhere, but I also don't think that they're especially powerful. I think that the spirit damage is certainly nice, but outside of that, not a lot of strength here. And really, inside of this build, I tend to lean towards higher trained, more experienced units as opposed to tokenizing units. And I think for that reason, the cost may not be worth leaning into to pick this one up when you first unlock it. and later down the line it loses a little bit of its versatility. It's a C tier for me. Inside of tier 3 order subjugation, we have Intimidating Aura. This one affects a whole load of unit types, right? Take a look. Shock, Polearm, Shield, Fighter, and Skirmish. So basically, we have near universal coverage here across the appropriate unit types, and we gain Intimidating Aura. Intimidating Aura. At the end of a unit's turn, adjacent enemies have a 90% chance of losing 5 morale, not applicable to tier 5 or hero units. So there's a overwhelmingly strong chance that units adjacent to yours will lose 5 morale thanks to Intimidating Aura, and of course we'll get that across the board. So anyone pushing up against us is going to slowly lose their morale, and if you're new here or unfamiliar, that will lean into things like the chance of a unit achieving a critical hit with high morale versus the chances of a unit fumbling or even fleeing with low morale. In this case, -5 is not huge. However, because it's applied to all of our units, 90% chance, fairly good chance of getting it off, we may be able to stack this across 2 or even 3 units, really destroying the morale of 1 or 2 enemy units in particular, while the rest suffer minor benefit. Unlocked inside of tier 3, this is of course a much more expensive enchantment that we're used to getting. Most of the things inside of this tome, for example, cost between 800 and 1100 research, so we're getting higher up in terms of our cost, but also this is quite a wide-reaching benefit. I'm giving Intimidating Aura a B tier. I think it's a strong ability. The negative morale can be stacked, we can use it, bring up our units adjacent to each other. There's some internal synergies, but it just lacks that overall really punch power that I'd like to see out of the second most expensive enchantment inside of the Ordered Tome. And I don't think it really compares equally to some of the other ones that are unlocked at tier 3 and other classes. What it does do is certainly very nice though. A B tier for me, as a relatively cheap enchantment to cast. And lastly, for Order at tier 4, we have Supreme Magic. Supreme Magic grants Zeal. Of course, we know what Zeal does, extra spirit damage, we've probably seen this before, and it makes destroying a unit cause it to explode, dealing 20 spirit damage to adjacent enemy units. This is obviously very strong when used appropriately. Got to make sure that the enemy are nice bundled together, at least in pairs. That isn't usually a problem inside of Age of Wonders, it's important to note. This applies to our Battle Mage units and our support units. I like the fact that it didn't just choose one or the other. It's nice that we have it across our magic class. And of course, the extra Zeal damage is always nice. Causing a unit to explode and deal 20 Zeal damage, spirit damage, I should say, very strong. Very strong indeed. Of course, with that condemnation effect, if we can pull that off too, this makes this even stronger. It's a very expensive one to unlock. It is the most expensive unit enchantment inside of the class, but the ability that it delivers is pretty decent. We don't see 20 spirit damage anywhere else. I give Supreme Magic a solid A tier ranking. I think that Supreme Magic is very good at what it does. It's an expensive unlock, but that 20 spirit damage from destroying an enemy and having that chain effect of it ripple through an enemy army, very good. It's an A tier for me. And we'll have to jump back just a little bit to Tome of Sanctuary, the other tier 3 unlock. Apologies. This skill level 5 unit enchantment grants us Faithful again, reducing unit upkeep, this time across 5 different categories from Shield to Skirmisher. Also, when taking fatal damage for the first time, it makes units unable to die or use offensive abilities for 1 turn. So basically, we have 1 turn of invulnerability once the enemy delivers a final blow. No, they don't. We're unable to perish or, unfortunately, use our offensive abilities for 1 turn. We can, of course, continue to use defensive abilities, heal abilities, summon abilities, and by this point in the game, there should be enough that we can still make use of our units for 1 more turn by throwing out a last-ditch heal or debuff. This is very strong, and it grants Faithful across 5 different unit categories. This is where Faithful is applied in a really meaningful way, and I think this is the best use of Faithful inside of the class. Keeper's Mark for me is an S tier ability. It can save you hundreds of thousands of gold across the game, thanks to its wide-reaching use of the Faithful ability, And having our units survive for one additional turn, even if it's just to block the enemy, let alone the various abilities that they could use when they unfortunately perish, is very strong from the moment you get it right the way through the rest of the game, thanks to the unit cap on armies in Age of Wonders 4, right? That generally 18v18 normal units plus whatever we can summon, siege craft in, etc., makes this even stronger. It's an S tier for me. Now let's move on to Chaos. First and foremost, we have the Tome of Pyromancy inside of Tier 1. We have Fiery Arrows. Fiery Arrows gives us a pretty nice and specialized effect. On our skirmisher units and ranged units, we get physical ranged attacks with a whopping +4 additional fire damage delivered. In exchange, however, we will lose to a -2 to our physical damage. Overall, of course, that's a net positive of +2. We'll also receive a base 30% chance of inflicting burning on an enemy, damage over time effect, and a very strong one. They sustain 8 fire damage per turn. It's almost like you're essentially hitting them with an extra unit, particularly at this tier level. Now, granted, it's only a 30% chance, though we should be able to pull this off fairly well, considering we're likely to have a lot of units at a relatively low tier inside of the Chaos grouping. Now, of course, some units can be immune to burn. There are different status resistances that have to be considered when we're taking away physical damage and adding fire damage specifically. The extra burn ability, though, the ability to burn the enemy, have them singe for 8 damage a turn, is very nice. How does this fit in with a broader context? Well, it only applies to a few units. It is, of course, just our ranged capacity. We should be using ranged capacity inside of most of our armies, though, so we should be able to get a reasonable benefit off this unit enchantment, unlocked fairly early and fairly useful. It's difficult for me to give it anything below an average ranking, and for that reason, I'll be placing it at a B tier. Inside of the same tome, we have the equivalent, but for swords. It's Searing Blades. +4 fire damage, -2 physical damage. In this case, though, the chance of burning has been reduced a little bit in comparison to our ranged friends. We now only have a 20% chance, so a 1 in 5 chance of burning the enemy. I think that the trade-off here is fair, though, because there are a lot of ways for us to potentially deal multiple attacks inside of this that we may not be able to do inside of ranged. More importantly, though, it impacts a wider variety of units, right? 5 different unit classes, all of our physical attackers, from skirmishers to fighters, shield, shock, and polearm. Everybody will benefit from +2 extra damage in the form of fire damage. That's net extra damage, of course, and then a 20% chance to burn every single time. I think Searing Blades is just fractionally better than the ability that our ranged companions will get, for the reason, well, for 2 reasons. Firstly, it's applied to a much broader variety of units, melee units, and secondly, I think that because of that, actually the reduced burning chance doesn't matter as much. If anything, I think we'll have a greater chance overall of burning the enemy in an average army. It's very close, but I am going to rank it just fractionally above at an A tier. This may frustrate a few people. These should be the same, but I think that there is a slight difference in power and versatility, and it is enough to just push this one up into A, whereas this one sat very near the top, but still within the B tier. Inside of the Tome of Mayhem, we have the Mark of Misfortune. Unlocked a tier 2 tome. This skill level 3 spell gives us Misfortune on 4 different unit groups. It's really nice. Basically, it takes the physical ranged and the sort of magical ranged units and applies this to all of them. So it's skirmishers and range, and it's battle mage and support units. What does it do? Well, my friends, it gives them Misfortune. Misfortune gives the opponent a 10% chance to fumble. Fumble basically reduces the damage of their attack by 50%. So it cuts their damage in half. Fumbles are usually caused by low morale. In this case, though, of course, it's by applying Misfortune to the enemy. When we attack them with our base attacks, it's applied, and it can be stacked up to 5 times. So potentially a 50% chance that the enemy will have a 50% chance, or that their damage will be reduced by 50%, I should say. So we can have up to a half chance of reducing their damage in half. If we say that we can stack this a couple of times, let's say there's a 25% chance, a quarter of a chance that the enemy's damage is halved from our ranged units, whether they're magical or physical, I think that's a pretty decent debuff. I think it's a nice ability, universally applied, and unlocked very early on. I think it's worthy of a high A tier ranking. Another one for Chaos at tier 2, this time inside of the Tome of Revelry, we have Blood Fury Weapons. Blood Fury Weapons gives us, on all of our physical fighters, the 5 units in the class, +5 morale, and +1 strengthened when they kill a unit. Strengthened will give us an extra 10% damage, and if we happen to kill multiple units, then we'll get to stack that. A really nice ability, applied alongside a positive morale boost. Melee and physical ranged attacks also gain +2 physical damage, just across the board. Blood Fury Weapons, unlocked at tier 2, very strong. We get that Blood Fury effect of extra morale and strength when we destroy a unit, allowing us to sort of go on a little bit of a rampage. Granted, a small one, though fairly significant by the time you start getting up to +20, +30% damage, and a universally applied +2 physical damage, potentially making up for any loss in physical damage we might have seen earlier. Nice synergies in class, and it applies across the board to melee and physical range damage. Very nice. Blood Fury Weapons for me is an S tier upgrade. I think it's unlocked early inside of tier 2 Tome. It's very cheap to cast, 80 mana, 80 casting points, and the benefit that it applies is almost universally good. Our units will be physically stronger, nice synergy within the class, and once they start to go on a rampage, they'll be strengthened as a result. Inside of the Tome of Pandemonium, we have Havoc Magic. Havoc Magic is an interesting one at tier 3. It grants our magic attacks, so sort of the complete opposite of what we were looking at before, right? Our battle mages and our support units, a 30% chance of inflicting a random negative status effect. Yes, there are ways to counter negative status effects, just like there are ways to counter physical damage with physical defense. In this case, we have a 30% chance of inflicting one random negative status effect. The randomness can make it difficult to build some internal synergies. Maybe you're reaching into other affinities and you're kind of struggling to pull together a build. However, all of our magic attacks will get it. That's nice. 30% applied, though, is not great. So 3 out of 10 attacks will provide a random negative status effect. There are a few caveats and qualifiers here that will reduce my rank for this one. The first, again, being that randomness, lack of internal synergy. The second being that that random effect is only applied 30% of the time. And finally, of course, it's a relatively few of our units at just 2 categories, Battle Mage and Support for those magic attacks, unlocked at tier 3. Unlocked at the mid-game and not really providing enough value for its somewhat expensive cost, right? Costs 50% more to cast than Blood Fury Weapons. And while it will have less of an impact on your unit upkeep costs because it impacts less units, it doesn't do enough for me at a 30% chance of one random negative effect. For me, I almost ranked it at a D tier, but I think that it's important to note that there are some synergies here. For me, I'm going to place it at a low C tier ranking for the minute. We may return to 1 or 2 things for some concessions at the end, but I'm pretty comfortable with where that is right now. Inside of the Tome of Devastation, a wonderful tome at tier 3 for sieges in particular, if you're a fan of those, we have Flame Burst Weapons. Flame Burst Weapons provide a 20% critical hit chance across our enchanted units, and there's a lot of them to boot. This, of course, gives us a 20% chance to deal 50% extra damage. Whenever our unit kills another unit, it also provides that effect that we saw a little earlier from spirit damage. In this case, fire. The unit will explode, dealing 20 fire damage to adjacent enemy units. So what does this do in a nutshell? Well, across all of our physical attackers, across our 5 different classes, we'll get an extra 20% chance to deal a critical hit, and that will deal 50% extra damage. I know you feel like you're in math class at the moment. Basically, there's a 1 in 5 chance that will deal an extra 50%. So 100 damage becomes 150. Not bad, though 20% is relatively low. We should have a lot of units, a lot of token units potentially inside of a Chaos build, and this will apply to a lot of them, hitting 5 different categories. The fact that when they destroy a unit, it causes it to explode and deal 20 fire damage to adjacent enemies is also very good. And again, strong internal synergies here with the class of us having a lot of units, a horde of units, and overwhelming the enemy. A lot of physical attackers too, dealing extra physical attack damage. Flame Burst weapons for me are an S tier pickup thanks to the strong internal synergy and the fact that the benefit can be universally applied across most of our units. It was a close call. I had initially placed it at a B tier due to its higher cost, but I think on balance, actually the fact that it's unlocked at tier 3, given the incredible amount of power and internal synergy it has, I'm happy placing it at an A tier. Inside of the same tome, great value for these two because you unlock them at the same time, we have Tome of Devastation. And inside, Focus of Devastation. Go figure. There's a theme here, everybody. This one grants magic attacks Demolisher. This is an interesting one. Few pop-ups here, which allows them to destroy fortified obstacles. So Demolisher smashes through any fortified obstacle. It can obviously be quite useful inside of normal fights, potentially, if the enemy's found cover, but generally, of course, this is for siege obstacles, right? It's for those big walls that they're hiding behind. This one lets our magic damage smash them down. There's also a 60% chance of cancelling enemy defense mode. A defense mode, of course, would normally extend the enemy's zone of control, grant them extra defense, resistance, and protection from flanking. With a 60% chance, that means we have a little over half chance of removing the enemy defense while also demolishing any fortified obstacles in front of them. It applies to our magic units only, of course, battle mage and support. What it delivers effectively is a way to destroy enemy siege fortifications. It allows your mage units and your support units to become a lot more like siege units with that demolisher effect. And then by removing enemy defensive zones, you potentially open up quite a defensive, Materium, potentially focused army to a lot of extra damage. Of course, you only have a 60% chance to do so. Slightly better odds than flipping a coin. This is very powerful when it comes to sieges in particular, but also this defensive damage, removing the enemy's defense, resistance, and flanking effect, quite strong, quite strong. Focus of Devastation, providing a lot of value inside of that beautiful Tome of Devastation for me, is also ranked at an A tier. Despite it only being a 60% chance, turning your magic units into siege units is very good. And it's not just during a siege, though. Destroying the enemy's ability to defend and hold themselves in defensive mode is a wonderfully unique ability. I think it's very good, worthy of an A tier pickup. And finally, for the Chaos build, inside of the Tome of Chaos Channeling, we have Demonic Focus. Demonic Focus, very strong. Applies to our Battle Mage and support units, and it grants +1 Strengthened. A reminder that this can stack 5 times, so potentially plus 50% damage once you've pulled it off a few times, and +5 temporary hit points whenever another unit dies in battle. This is another unit, so it could be friendly, could be enemy. Obviously, there are massively strong internal synergies here with the Chaos build itself, with those tier 1 units throwing out a lot of tokens. Every time one of them perishes, our Battle Mage and support units get that 10% damage, so we should be pushing right up to the 50%, and also 5 temporary hit points. This one not capped at any sort of stack limit, so the number that you could get here is potentially very high. These abilities combine really well to keep your units alive and grant them 50% extra damage. Granted, this is unlocked fairly late, and it is a fairly expensive one to research and also cast, but it is very strong at giving your units sticking power, and sticking power matters almost more than anything else in combat in Age of Wonders 4, thanks to a lot of reasons, including the 18 versus 18 cap on traditional world exploring battle units. Demonic Focus for me is an S tier pickup. Of course, I detract a little bit overall for the expensive cost and relatively late unlock of this tier 4 unlock, but the internal synergies and overwhelming power and stacking power that this provides. It will keep your strong mage units alive while your physically fighting weaker token units run in with their extra strength, their insane abilities, lots of strong internal synergy, and I think that this one, above all else, brings it all together. It's an S tier for me. And now we move to nature, the affinity that actually has the least out of any of them at the moment, with just 6 enchantments. Let's have a look firstly at Tome of Roots. Inside of tier 1, we have Poison Blades, and of course we're going to follow it up with Poison Arrow. The two of them deal essentially the same thing, but to different unit classes. So Poison Arrows, of course, applies to our ranged units, that's ranged and skirmishers, and then our Poison Blade applies to those 5 physical classes: Skirmisher, Polearm, Shock, Shield, and Fighter. What do they do? Well, they do the same thing, again, just the different categories, +4 blight damage in exchange for a -2 physical. So the net impact here is +2. We've seen this kind of thing play out in Chaos. Here it is again now for blight damage. We also gain a 30% chance of inflicting poison. That's right. In this case, it's 8 blight damage per turn. Previously, with Chaos, we saw 8 fire damage from burning. So it's a very similar effect. It's just playing out in a different way. In this case, it's unlocked at tier 1, right from the word go, with some relatively cheap spells through Poison Arrows and Poison Blades. These two are slightly more similar than their previous counterparts, although again, I would note that the Blades applies to more unit classes than ranged. And so again, I tend to weight the Blades slightly higher than the ranged. In this case, their chance of applying Blight is the same, though. And so the ranged one actually comes closer to power for me than the Blades. Again, though, to reiterate, it's much the same. They both sit basically on the border between B tier and A tier. In this case, I'm going to apply an A tier ranking to both of them, thanks to a lot of reasons. Their cheap unlock, their strong internal synergy, and I think they roughly compare the same. Though I would also say, like I did earlier, right on the fence for me. Could be applied at A, could be applied at B. It does depend a little bit on internal synergy, but I think the early unlock pushes them up here for me, and they just rank at the A tier. Inside of the tier 2 Tome of Glades, we have Aspect of the Root. Aspect of the Root is an interesting one. It gives our shield and pole units, so just a couple of the more obviously defensive units, this ability. It has a 2-turn cooldown. It allows them to heal 30 temporary hit points, which is a really strong heal at this point in the game. Tier 2 unlocks 30 extra hit points is great. And it also forces them to enter defense mode, which gives them, of course, extra defense, resistance. Their zone of control is further, and they're immune to flanking. This is a very powerful, obviously defensive ability. Forcing you into defensive mode will limit your aggressive potential, obviously. It's very focused around doing one thing, and that's protecting units, healing them up 30 points, and shielding them for the next round. It's really great, actually, at keeping particularly your key units or your units that you may not have many of, maybe you've got them for a special purpose, alive, and allowing them to stay alive. If it applied to more units, I would have ranked this one higher, but for me, it's a strong B tier. What it does very well. You'll be able to keep your shield unit alive for sure. However, that's kind of all that you'll be able to do with it, and for that reason, I'll be ranking it at a B tier. Inside of the Tome of Vigor, we have, of course, wonderful internal synergies like super growth, something I'm a big fan of, because I just think that this tome in particular, with Unleash Beasts, Summon Animal, leans greatly into what this affinity does. However, here, of course, I've already covered race transformations in a different tier list. We're looking at Empowered Beasts. What does it do? Very strong. It affects animals, so we should have strong internal synergy for that. Gives them plus 20% damage. Woof. Plus 10 extra hit points. Nice. And they gain Demolisher, making them slightly more akin to a siege unit, able to smash through reinforced obstacles. The potential slight downside here is that we have a decreased number of units in our formation. So if our formation usually had, let's say, 6 units, and now it's been decreased down to let's say for this example, 5 or 4. That's potentially a slight debuff for us, because as our units get taken out, it's a much more significant percentage of that army, right? So if I have 8 units and we take 50 damage, I lose 2 dudes, I'm down to 6. If we have 6 units and I take 50 damage and I lose 2 units, potentially now I'm down to 4. I'm down to 66% of my army instead of 75%. So there are potentials here for it to cause great, significant loss. But also, I would argue that in an army with a lot of weaker units, with an army with a high number of units, information, and a lot of token units, the impact that this has is less significant. And of course, it won't impact units that just have 1 in their army, like heroes. I think on balance, this is a very strong ability, and the slight debuff of decreased number of units in formation does not outweigh the overall massive benefits that are being applied to our slightly tokenistic animals in our armies. Empowered Beasts for me is an S tier pick. I think any potential downside does not outweigh the power, first of all. And then when I stack in the fact that it's unlocked relatively early and it has very low opportunity costs thanks to the value of the tome and great internal synergies, it's an S tier pick for me. Inside of the Tome of Cycles, we have Projectiles of Decay, unlocked at tier 3 again. This one is about blight damage. It gives our physical and magic attacks, so it applies to a nice category of 4 units, plus 2 blight damage. Nice. No trade-off here, just another plus 2 to our blight. We also gain now a 90% base chance of inflicting decaying damage, an overtime effect that stops enemies from healing. So units will sustain 5 blight damage, and they cannot regain their traditional hit points. Note that it doesn't affect ethereal or undead units. Generally, though, you will be able to carry this out, though watch out for those undead units later in the game. And not being able to heal their base hit points is a really nice effect. Of course, they may be able to work around this through temporary hit points, maybe, but it's still a nice benefit. And at a 90% chance, even if we just look at the 5 blight damage, it's a very high chance of inflicting an extra 5 on top of the 2. Most of the time, you'll be looking at an extra 7 blight damage for these units. As the second most expensive enchantment in class, it's pretty high up there in terms of its cost, despite the fact that it's unlocked at tier 3, comparable with Empowered Beasts. It does cost more to hold, and potentially to upkeep, though that is a little bit more determined by you and the composition of your army. Plus 2 extra blight damage is a nice impact, and at a 90% chance of dealing 5 more, plus preventing the enemy from healing, this is a significant boost across our ranged units. I don't think it's significant enough in terms of its overall power impact for the price to grant it an S tier. For me, it sits on the border between A and B. I'm going to place it at a B tier because of the way that blight damage can be resisted or avoided, particularly as we move through. Here's looking at you, Shadow Empires. This one may not have the impact of some of the others over the course of your game. And inside of tier 5, unlocked very late. If you've got this tier 5 tome, you're probably building your magic victory condition at this point because you've unlocked it. So I have to keep that in mind, but let's take a look at Force of Nature. Force of Nature provides a 20% bonus to your critical hit chance, a reminder that'll deal an extra 50% damage. That's a great buff to your crit hit. You'll also receive a +4 blight damage on all of your base attacks. This one affects all of your animals, all of your plants, and your cavalry. You should have a lot of plants. In fact, you should be plant people by this point. So this one can basically be considered to be universally applied more so than almost anything else that we've looked at in terms of the types of unit that it impacts. However, it is a great cost at 2,000 research inside of your tier 5 tome. Do you want to do this, or do you want to get mass rejuvenation? You're probably not looking at Forest Awakens, but mass rejuvenation may be a better spell pickup than this unit enchantment. However, of course, I am just comparing enchantments to enchantments inside of this tier list, so I won't apply too much of a weighting for that, but I think the general principle of this one being unlocked very late still has to be considered. It's just so late in the game, especially if I'm assuming that your magic victory is the pathway that you're taking. If you're going for more of a domination victory, though, this could be the difference in turning the tide from defeat to victory. Though something again like mass rejuvenation within the class may be slightly better at doing that, I think that Force of Nature is very powerful, universally applied benefit at a high cost. I give Force of Nature an A tier ranking, only losing out from the top ranking again because of that high cost. The fact that you don't get it quite late means that you may not have much of an opportunity to use it, and it may not be aligned with your victory condition. That being said, you'll still need to defend your magic victory once you've built the conditions. So either way, you're likely to be fighting in the final 15 turns regardless. For that reason, I'm placing it at an A tier ranking for its high power and strong synergies. And now, my friends, I'm going to take a pause here and we'll return for part 2, the final part, where I'll cover off the remaining 3 affinities next time, very soon. I'm deciding to separate this out, not because I'm looking to farm views or impressions or anything like that, but because I don't think that these videos should be the length of feature-length films. I think that's very off-putting for a lot of viewers. You've expressed to me that you'd like them in slightly more manageable chunks, so this one will be in 2 parts. Thanks for watching, see you next time.